Muted.
Ready for joining this webinar. I see that some names of participants are from some of our existing certified farms and growing operations. So welcome to you. And then I also see that there's a number of individuals that are perhaps interested in seeking certification but are not yet certified. So the presentation today is going to be focusing on the Fairtrade USA launch of the new agricultural production standard. So let me just run through the agenda really quickly. So what we're going to do is just give an introduction to the standard and talk about some of the important components, the launch timeline, how this standard is different from the previous standards, and some important changes there, the scope of certification and the compliance system. And then we'll talk a little bit more focused on what that transition timeline is going to mean for some of our existing clients, and then we'll go into what the steps for certification are, and that will be especially targeted towards some of our interested operations that are not yet certified, or for some of our existing clients who are maybe looking at bringing on board additional types of growing operations. And then of course at the end we will have time to answer any questions and go over next steps. So during the course of the presentation I would ask that you write any questions that you might have using the chat feature, and we will collect those throughout the presentation and then address the questions towards the end. This presentation will be given in English, but you can feel free to write your questions in Spanish. And of course, if you would be seeking a response in Spanish, we can do that as well. And if anything is not clear, clearly understood in English, and you would like a clarification on any of the points discussed in Spanish, then we can also use the time at the end of the presentation to clarify anything presented in Spanish. So let's begin. Oh, and I will also just add that I will be leading the beginning part of this presentation, and then I'm going to be passing the presentation off to my co-presenter, Stephanie Alderson, who works with me in the Fairtrade USA program. So the biggest news is that the agricultural production standard has been launched effective March 1st. 2017, which means that the standard is published. The majority of the normative documents that support the standard have been published. The policies that are associated with the standard, things like that. And the agricultural production standard will be replacing the 3 existing Fairtrade USA standards that are currently in effect. And these 3 standards are the Farm Workers Standard, the Independent Smallholder Standard, and the Small Producer Organization Standard. So these 3 Fairtrade USA standards have been the standards that we have been using and auditing to in the Fairtrade program for the last 5 years. And these 3 standards have been applied broadly across different geographies. They have been applied in Latin America and Africa and Asia, and to a very limited extent in Canada. The 3 standards have gone through a process of revision, which has been a multi-year process that Fairtrade USA has undertaken, incorporating quite a bit of stakeholder comment and conducting some field testing, which SCS conducted last year in 2016, in order to finally arrive at what is now the agricultural production standard. So it has been a multi-year effort, and the goal was to create one standard to replace the 3 and have that standard be functional across a large variety of different agriculture production operations. Now, the standard was officially published March 1st, 2017, but the date that the standard will be made effective, or in other words, the date that operations can begin to be audited and certified to the new standard, is going to be May 1st, 2017. So right now we are in a 2-month period where operations can look over the new normative documents, can look over the new standards, and begin to digest the new requirements and begin to implement those new requirements. On our end, we are in the process of getting our auditors trained and ready to conduct audits to this new standard. Now, this process has been ongoing for over 6 months now in terms of getting our auditors up to speed on any changes in the new standard. And what that means is that all audits that will be undertaken starting May 1st, 2017 will be under the new standard. The scope of the new agricultural production standard is broader than the 3 previous standards, and really the general set of requirements that were found in the previous standards are also found in the agricultural production standard. They are organized in 6 modules, and they are applied according to the type of operation that is being certified. So, for example, the scope of certification can cover a single entity or a single company, a single integrated farm, and that would be very similar to how the farm worker standard worked previously. The scope of the certificate can also cover a group of legal entities or a group of different companies or owners which have different sizes of farms, so perhaps small farms and medium farms and large farms. And then it can also incorporate cooperatives or independent smallholders who are organized by a market access partner. And those last 2 examples are very similar to the types of operations that previously were certified under the Independent Smallholder Standard and the Small Producer Organization Standard. So really the Agriculture Production Standard is bringing together the different types of agriculture supply chains that can be found and applying the requirements according to the type of operation that it is. So you can see, I'll just try and use my mouse here, this image that I'm kind of circling over kind of shows that a certificate holder can oversee large farms, and those are the boxes in green that say LF, medium farms, which are the boxes in blue, and small farms. And so now that can all be under one certificate instead of it being under multiple certificates. So yeah, a couple of important things to know about the scope of the certification. So the certificate holder may hold the Agricultural Protection Standard Certificate on behalf of other legal entities in the supply chain other than itself. Of course, the certificate holder would be holding the certificate for itself, but apart from that, it can take responsibility for other legal entities. Now, in order to do that, the certificate holder must implement and have a sufficient internal management system that oversees compliance at the level of the other legal entities. And by legal entities, I mean it could be a separate company or it could be an individual farmer. The APS modules that are broken up between modules 1 through 6 each have different focuses, and module 6 is specifically focused on this internal management system. Now the APS certificate holder is the entity that would be buying and selling the fair trade product, and that's an important distinction. So the other important consideration for scope is that in the scope of the Agriculture Production Standard, all sites where farming and harvesting of the fair trade certified product must be included in the scope of the certificate. In other words, the scope of the certificate cannot just be the processing facility, or it cannot just be the buyer of the product. It has to include the farm level and include the actual growing and harvesting of that product. One of the biggest changes that is coming with the Agricultural Production Standard is the categorization of sites by size. So there are 3 categories of size that the Agricultural Production Standard recognizes, and those are small, medium, and large. And by sites, I mean a farm, and I also mean a processing or a packing facility, and I also mean a storage facility. So any individual site is categorized based on the rules in APS, and those rules are really based on the amount of permanent and temporary workers that are employed at the site. Another very important component of the scope of the certificate relates to workers and the work that is being conducted. So all on-site regular work and the workers in the production chain are included in the scope of the certificate. And this includes workers that are directly hired by the certificate holder or the legal entities under the scope. And it also includes subcontracted workers that may be working on the sites that are included in the scope of certification. And the working conditions for all the workers on any site must follow the Agriculture Production Standard requirements. Even if, for example, let's say you have a large farm that is growing multiple crops, let's say tomatoes and watermelons, and let's say, for example, only watermelons are covered under the scope of the Fair Trade Certificate, the working conditions for all of the workers, so the workers that are working on tomatoes and watermelons, would fall under the scope of APS. So another thing to mention about the certificate holder and the relationship with legal entities that it might be covering under its certificate is that the certificate holder must either be in the same country as its suppliers that are included in the scope of the certificate, or have a local majority-owned subsidiary which is responsible for implementing the internal management system, which is covered under Module 6. Another important thing to mention is that the certificate holder may sell product from entities included in the scope of their APS certificate as fair trade certified, once certified, that is to say. The certificate holder may also buy products from other APS certificate holders and sell them as fair trade certified. So the important distinction here is that there is a certificate that is covering that product before it is sold. Another thing that I might just explain a little bit more is this concept of a site. So when I say site, I am talking about a farm. The definition that Fairtrade USA is using for site is a natural grouping of one or more buildings or farms with a common workforce, which might work at different places on different tasks, or where workers might cross paths during the day even if they do not work together. So it could include a complex of greenhouses with a common entrance. It would include any worker housing that is provided by the certificate holder, even if that worker housing is not located, let's say, in the same physical location as where the crops are being grown. Okay, so now to move on to a little bit of information about the compliance system. So the changes that are being made to the compliance system under the agricultural production standard are quite different from how the compliance system is structured in the current standards. And the biggest difference is that now the compliance criteria, which is the term used for the specific requirements that are under the agricultural production standard, now those compliance criteria are divided into two categories, or rather two levels of compliance are being asked of all operations seeking certification. And these two distinctions are, first, there are critical compliance criteria. These are compliance criteria that must be met by a specific time frame. So the most common example, an example that's most similar to how the existing standards are structured, is that there are critical requirements that need to be met by the certification year. These are generally categorized by year 0 as the evaluation year, or this is the initial audit, the first audit before certification is granted. Year 1, so this would be the first annual surveillance audit, and all of these critical compliance criteria must be met by that time frame. Year 3 and year 6. So these are the critical criteria that operations will need to look at meeting by the audit that is occurring in that time frame. So year 0, just to reiterate, year 0 is the evaluation year. Year 1 would be the first annual surveillance audit, and year 3 would be the recertification audit. There are also a number of critical compliance criteria that are set to be implemented after a certain step has been fulfilled. These critical compliance criteria are mostly found in Module 1. Module 1 is the module in the Agricultural Production Standard that focuses on what is really the fair trade model. So this is the election of a fair trade committee, the management of what is the fair trade premium. And within Module 1, there are a number of critical compliance criteria that do not have a specific certification year, but rather would follow according to the implementation of the fair trade program. Some of the best examples are there are specific compliance criteria that need to be met after the Fair Trade Committee is elected. There are others that need to be met after the needs assessment has been conducted but before year 1. There are others that need to be met after premium is received but before premium is spent. So the actual timeline of when these critical criteria need to be met is spelled out according to the parameters of each specific compliance criteria. So now we'll move on to progress criteria. And this is the category of compliance criteria that is most different from how any of the existing operations understand the expectations of compliance. So the progress criteria are found only in modules 3 and 4. And I'll just say that modules 3 and 4 are the two modules that are very specifically focused at the farm level or the site level. So this could be the farm where product is being grown, or it could be a packing house where the product is being packed and shipped out. And then in modules 3 and 4, there will also be some critical criteria, but there will be a subset of criteria that are called progress criteria. And these progress criteria represent continuous improvement that are met along a 6-year timeline. Now what that means is that each operation that is certified currently, and additionally each operation that is seeking certification, will look at the set of progress compliance criteria and choose how that operation will meet the requirements for the progress compliance criteria over a 6-year period. So the choice is really given to the client on which requirements they will fulfill in which years. What this means is that operations can look at the set of progress compliance criteria and they can decide which requirements make the most sense for their operation, or which requirements will need a little bit more time and investment to fulfill, and they can set a path of implementation and compliance over this 6-year time frame. The progress compliance criteria have point values that are assigned to each requirement, and those values are 1, 3, or 5. And the actual values will vary according to the size of the site or the facility. Now what this means is that for a specific compliance criteria, let's say the compliance criteria is that all workers receive written contracts. This specific requirement, this is just an example, might have a value of 1 at a large farm, and it might have a value of 3 or 5 at a small farm. Now what Fairtrade USA has done here is they have tried to assign point values to correlate with giving more points for requirements that may be more difficult to comply with at the level of the site or the facility. So in the example of the written contracts, the general expectation would be that a large farm would very easily be able to comply with this. They would have a human resources department, and they're probably already doing this. So they would only get a progress point of 1. Now, in comparison, a small farm might have some logistical challenges to having this much paperwork for all of their employees, so they are going to give a higher point value because it is seen as a higher level of practice for that level of the farm. Now I'm only giving an example here because I believe in the actual standard the requirement is different from the example I'm giving you, so I want to be clear that this is just a hypothetical example, just to explain how it works. So what I want to show you on this screen is really the compliance expectation for progress criteria. So you'll see in the box that there are progress criteria and there are critical criteria, and on the left-hand side of the table you see Module 1, Module 2, Module 3, Module 4, Module 5, and Module 6. Now, as I mentioned previously, Module 1 is specific to the Fairtrade program, and you will see there are no progress criteria in Module 1. Module 2 is specific to forced labor, child labor, discrimination. There are no progress criteria in this module as well. Module 3 and Module 4 contain the labor, occupational health and safety, environmental requirements that are specific to the farm and site level, and this is where you get your progress criteria. Module 5 is focused on traceability. There are no progress criteria there, and Module 6, as I mentioned previously, is focused on the internal management system. Now you'll also notice that the percentage of progress criteria is the same between the modules, so that does not change, and the percentage of progress points is also the same across any farm size. So what that means is it doesn't matter if you have medium farms, large farms, or small farms. In year 0, in order to meet the compliance, the minimum compliance expectations, you must meet 40% of the total number of progress points for that farm size. That means if your operation has large farms or large sites and small farms and or sites, you need to meet that 40% threshold for both of those farm size categories. It would be a great idea to progress upward from there between year 0 and 2 so that your total percentage is higher than 40%. But in terms of the audit and the results of the audit, you do not need to show that you are reaching a higher percentage in those initial years until you get to year 3. Now at year 3, you must reach 70%. So that means that you basically have between year 0 and year 3 to gradually implement and increase your percentage of compliance. But it also means that you will not be deemed in the year 1 audit or the year 2 audit unless you fall below that 40%. Once you get to the year 3 audit, however, you must meet the 70% threshold. So that is the important distinction. And then again, between the recertification year 3 audit and the year 6 audit, you then have multiple years to bring compliance up to 100%. And that would be meeting all of the progress points for that farm size. This scoring system and the progress points is a new concept to the Fairtrade USA program, so I invite any questions that you might have on how this might work. I invite you to please write those in your chat box, and we'll be happy to try and answer those at the end of the presentation. So now what I want to show you is just kind of what the different types of compliance criteria look like within the standard. I didn't mention previously, but I'll mention now, there is another distinction besides points that are given that is best practice, and that is signified by this BP that you see here in blue at the small farm level. So SF is small farm, MF is medium farm, LF is large farm. Now best practice is written specifically for small farm within modules 3 and 4, and I would have to refer to the standard to be able to tell you whether best practices are found in any of the other modules, but definitely in modules 3 and 4. And what this means for small farms is that this specific compliance criteria does not apply to the small farm for the purposes of the audit. Now, if the small farm is implementing the compliance criteria, that is great. It is viewed as a best practice, but it also means that if the small farm is not implementing the compliance criteria, they will not receive any sort of ding on the audit. In other words, there would not be a nonconformity. You can see in this particular example that this compliance criteria is seen as a best practice for the small farm. So in other words, they do not need to implement this for the purposes of passing the audit. but they are recognized as a best practice if they do implement it. For a medium farm, this particular compliance criteria is given progress points. This means that at the medium farm, they can choose whether they will implement this in year 0, in year 2, all the way up to year 6. They choose when to implement. At the large farm, you will see it says C-YO. Now that means it's a critical compliance criteria in year 0. So this specific requirement must be met at the large farms and sites in year 0, which is the evaluation audit. So I hope that that better explained how the actual standard shows the different types of compliance criteria and compliance requirements. So this is just another example, just so that it's clear as well. So you can see, so the column on the left would be the small farm, the column in the middle would be medium farm, and the column on the right would be the large farm. And this is another example where there are points that are assigned to the farm size, and you can see here that the small farm would receive 5 points, and the medium farm would receive 1 point. The large farm, this is again a critical compliance criteria and must be met before the evaluation audit or at the time of the evaluation audit. So this is another example where they're giving a little bit more points to the small farm because they are recognizing that this would be more difficult for the small farm to implement than the medium farm. And the other example that you can see for 241A is an example of a compliance criteria that is critical for all farm and site levels. So yeah, so just to reiterate, the C means critical, Y indicates the year, and in contrary, P means points, and then the number is the number of points. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit about the transition timeline for APS. So as we mentioned at the start of the presentation, the Agricultural Production Standard was published on March 1st, and we are now within the 60-day period before audits occur. So May 1st, 2017 will be the day that audits will begin to be conducted under the Agricultural Production Standard. Now what that means for existing certificate holders is that you will follow your annual audit timeline. So if you generally receive your audit in October, November, you will receive your audit during that time frame, but you will receive your audit to the Agriculture Production Standard. For those of you who might be on the call who have an audit coming up, if your audit is occurring in April, then your audit will be to the existing standards. If your audit is set to occur after May 1st, your audit will be to the Agricultural Production Standard. Now, Fairtrade USA has established a transition policy, and this transition policy is available on their website. For the existing clients, you would have received this in an email communication from us, from SCS. And then the policy is also part of the materials that we are sharing with you as part of this webinar. I invite you to read through that policy to better understand what the agricultural production standard transition looks like for you and your operation. But let me summarize the biggest point. All existing certificate holders, so all clients that are currently certified, Fairtrade USA certified with SCS, will have 1 year from the APS publication date to close any nonconformities that might be raised in the 2017 audit, or I should include early 2018. But there will be 1 year to close out any nonconformities that might be a result of an audit that are nonconformities to new agricultural production standard compliance criteria. So what does new mean? New means that it would be a requirement that is unique to the agricultural production standard and a requirement that was not previously required of the certificate holder in the previous standard. So that is going to be a little bit different for a client who was certified under the farm worker standard to a client who was certified under the independent smallholder standard, because those two standards have very different requirements. But what it does mean is that any compliance criteria that was not expected of the certificate holder under the previous standard would have up until March 1st, 2018 to close out any nonconformity. And by close out, I mean resolve any nonconformity that is raised during the audit. So let's just give an example. Under the agricultural production standard, a new requirement is that operations will create a labor committee. Now, a labor committee was not a requirement found in any of the previous standards. This labor committee has different requirements based on whether it's a small farm, medium farm, or large farm, but the general gist of it is an actual creation of a labor committee would not be required until March 1st, 2018. That means if it comes up as a nonconformity in the next audit, the client will receive the nonconformity during the audit, but they will have up until March 1st, 2018 to demonstrate compliance to that requirement. So I hope that that is clear. The other important distinction that I want to note about the distinction of what a new requirement is, or what is a new APS compliance criteria, this is something that Fairtrade USA is defining specifically, and so it is not up to SCS to look through the standard and define which requirements are new or unique, and it's also not up to the certificate holders to do that. This will be a select list of compliance criteria that Fairtrade USA will define as new and fitting within this transition policy. So you do not have to do any work to try and figure this out. You will just need to wait to receive the information from Fairtrade USA, and this is something that they are still working on, so we also do not have that list yet, but it is forthcoming. So now I want to turn the presentation over to my colleague Stephanie, and then at the end we will give time for questions.
Hello everyone, this is Stephanie Alderson. I work with Bonnie here at SCS at the Fairtrade program, and I just wanted to go over the certification process. This will be a reminder for current clients and just kind of setting the stage for new clients who want to get certified under Fairtrade APS. So the first step is obviously to apply for the certification. We've attached the application as well to the materials list, but the application will be sent to Fairtrade USA. That's something that we can provide, the application, but Fairtrade USA will be working with the client on setting the scope and kind of filling that information out. And then us at SCS, we will obviously help schedule and plan the logistics of the audit, but any implementation questions would be directed to Fairtrade USA. So once you apply, Fairtrade USA will work with you on that. They send over the application to us. We develop the quote and we'll send it out to the client, and once there's approval for that, then the client needs to prepare for the audit. Any implementation questions would be helped out by Fairtrade USA, and then once the audit is scheduled, we confirm the audit date and provide the audit plan and any kind of necessary documents that would be needed to prepare. And once we do that, we will come on site and conduct the audit. So the SES auditor will evaluate all the production sites and workforce to assess compliance. And once the audit has been completed, the auditor will prepare the report and send it over to us here at the office, and we complete a technical review. So we're looking at the audit report and the non-compliances to ensure quality and consistency. And that audit report will be sent to the client 20 business days from audit close. What that means is about 1 month from the audit date. And once you receive the report, that is when the client will prepare the corrective action plan. So preparing the corrective and preventative actions for the non-compliances. And you'll have 1 month to work on those corrective actions and send that over to us here at SCS. We evaluate those and we go through the corrective action process. So it would come to us, we would evaluate it, and if it's sufficient, we would close it. If not, we would resubmit the corrective action report back for further information, further evidence to ensure compliance. And once all the nonconformities have been closed, that is when we issue the certificate. So so again, once that's all completed and closed, we issue the certificate decision, which would be the APS certificate. So to note for existing clients, when you are going through your upcoming audit, you will receive the APS certificate once all of those have been closed. And same with our new clients, once you go through the corrective active process. Once all of those are closed, then you will get the certificate, the APS certificate. So I just wanted to kind of go over that whole process for you as well. And just as a reminder, the audit is an annual surveillance audit. So there's the evaluation and the recertification the third year, but every year we have an auditor come on site and around the same time during the harvest period to evaluate compliance to the fair trade standard. So next steps, the APS compliance criteria and any of the documents associated with the new criteria can be found on the Fairtrade website under the Standards Download Center. We've included the link there for you to access. And yeah, I kind of mentioned earlier that for existing certificate holders, your certificate will be updated once the annual audit cycle has been completed. And for new applicants, Fairtrade USA will work with you directly to finalize your application, and the application can also be found at the same link, Fairtrade USA website, under the Standards Download Center. And again, we've included the materials for you to access under this webinar. We've included the standard, the application, the transition policy, as well as the prohibited and restricted pesticides list, which has recently been updated and is applicable now. So we wanted to provide that information. And that closes our presentation, and just wanted to open it up